To see everyone here in this ongoing series that I think has already had a pretty substantial impact in terms of learning and spreading learning from leading experts across communications fields. And we have some really exciting further sessions, but uh, perhaps I have been so excited about today's session because Lee Rainey is like a national treasure, and we would know almost nothing about the internet if Lee didn't spent all those years as the founding director of internet and tech research at the Pew Research Center. He has his new perch at Elon University, and he's running a very exciting center there. We're in Lee's debt as a society, really, in terms of being able to learn empirically about like what's going on online, how to communicate. And Lee's team, through the years um, has really led the charge on making information graphics, data viz legible to the public. And so we had asked Lee to come today to talk to us about how to communicate data, quantitative information, qualitative information in this new AI environment. And so without further ado, Lee, thank you so much for coming. And the floor is yours. We'll take questions in about 40 minutes.
Thanks so much, John. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be invited here. I'm honored, and I don't deserve that introduction, but I'll take it. Thank you for your generosity. Um, I am going to be telling a bunch of stories from my data in my days at the Pew Research Center, and less so from my life at Elon. But it's basically a continuation of the work I was doing at the Pew Research Center, and I got some war stories to tell, and I've got some tips I think that might be useful to the attendees here. I just want to maybe start by emphasizing that you are part of a grand tradition that's millennia old of telling stories with data. As far as anyone can tell, or at least as far as the internet can tell, these are the first discovered pieces of represented reality through data. A map of the Egyptian mining aspirations of Ramses IV. He was trying to quarry sandstone to build some monuments to himself. And it's the papyrus renderings of his plans to excavate much of the material there. But it's part of a long chain of history and really progress in using data to tell stories. Maps of all kinds do that. But over the years and over the centuries, really, the tone of it, the power of it, and the persuasive elements of it have gotten much greater, thanks to lots of heroes. I want to emphasize here a sort of starting American point on this because it's James Madison is sort of a champion of the story. Whoops, remove spotlight. Are you seeing my slides or are you seeing me? I'm a little confused.
We're seeing both.
Oh,
You're seeing you and the slides.
I think I'm
Okay.
just looking at the wrong speaker gallery.
Everything's
Hold,
fine. Everything's fine.
except I can't see my slides. Oh, darn. Hold on just a split second here. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share again.
Okay. Sorry, I need to do something with, give me a moment. Speaker.
Thanks, Mass.
Yes.
He was, one of the great data creators in the world, and probably the earliest champion in our kind of government for the kind of work that many of the participants here do. The sort of famous quote from him is that a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. It was a basic statement of how democracy sort of depends on persuasion rather than pointing guns at people's heads and deliberation, and that data is the essential building block of the evidence that people, he hoped, would bring to our democracy and our deliberations. He created he was basically the grand creator and thinker of why a census would matter, because censuses had been done for a time, but he imagined census as a backbone of representative democracy, where you get to see what your polity looks like. You get to see where its legitimacy lies. Ideally, data are collected in a fair way that allows for self-government and allows for people to talk to each other again rather than trying to do harm to each other. And his vision of the one of the new elements that he brought to the vision of the census was that it would be a living instrument. It would keep renewing itself, and it would mark change over time in a nation's history. And so it was a sort of a bedrock idea of the founding of the constitutional order of this country. One of the maybe lesser sung heroes of the story of important public information is Herbert Hoover, who in his administration basically saw data as a way to promote public understanding of life around them. But in particular, it was seen as a sort of pushback mechanism against propaganda and yellow journalism. Yellow journalism had been an essential part of the media landscape at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And propaganda was becoming a much more noticed phenomenon in the age of mass media, particularly the rise of radio. He had come to the presidency from the Commerce Department, so he was thinking a lot about business and business cycles and measuring things that were going on in business. But one of the great innovations he brought to government data collection was to see data as a storytelling mechanism for social conditions. There are ways in which just understanding what was going on in cities, particularly as urbanization was becoming an enormous mega trend in the country, and thinking about how to understand households through gathering information about the conditions of cities and things like that. And it was his data set the stage for all the other fabulous data innovations in public life that particularly grew under FDR in the rise of the administrative state. Eisenhower was particularly important in being an advocate for data in the dawn of the sort of big science, public science era. Lyndon Johnson, of course, used data to fight social problems and illuminate them in important ways that drove big policy changes. Richard Nixon was part of this story. The founding of the Environmental Protection Agency was a data-driven policy change because there were so many ways that we were measuring pollution of various kinds that became almost an inevitable consequence to create an agency to begin to address the problems that were surfacing there. And one of the great things that Obama did, one of his maybe less heralded things, was to bring data and data collection and data analysis into the digital age. He famously understood the power of social media as he was running politics, but even more importantly, his data collection efforts and data illustration efforts sort of put the process on steroids. I want to again sort of salute another hero William Playfair, who was a sort of a rogue and a hustler and a very ambitious guy. And he created a thing called the Commercial and Political Atlas that he used to sort of gain entry to the Royal Palace in the UK. And it was the first document that ever used line charts and bar charts to illustrate data. And it was sort of his great insight was that abstractions then become visible. Things that people didn't quite understand or couldn't quite themselves visualize were things that they could then grasp as numbers became applied to them. And the sort of grander idea was the charts became arguments. That again, if the data were done well and done in a compelling way, they could drive an argument and drive policy change because they were easy methods to understand big forces that were unfolding in a culture. I guess one of the final heroes that I would like to salute in this story is Hans Rosling, who essentially taught the world that data visualization is an enormously compelling thing. If you've seen his TED Talks, they're just sort of magical things. And his basic instinct was a great one, which is to think counter-conventionally. He wanted data to be brought to bear on a sort of the conventional wisdom about what was going on in the world. And so he enshrined the idea that data visualization, particularly sort of data in motion, as he illustrated, was a really important thing. And he died not a few years ago and is still one of the great um, innovators in this space. So I come from the Pew Research Center, and I'm apologizing to many of you who are stewards of administrative data. I'm not sure that some of the things I'm going to be saying are directly relevant because one of the nice things about survey data is you get to think what stories you want to tell before you're telling the stories. And in many cases, collectors of administrative data do just that and are building stories after the fact as they see what patterns develop and see what storylines sort of emerge from their analysis. But I think some of the skills are sort of universal, and some of the sensibilities can apply both in the survey area as well as other kinds of data collection. So again, the Pew Research Center is well known for getting attention for its data. And I think part of that is just from the mission of the Pew Research Center, which to be not only nonpartisan, but non-advocacy. It was a firing offense when I worked at Pew to give my personal opinion whenever I was in a public setting or in a public place or when I was being interviewed by the media. They were scrupulously insistent that we at the center live by our data and explain the world through our data and not bring our own sort of personal agendas or personal sensibilities to telling that story. So that was, it was that sort of neutral mindset, I think, was part of the appeal of the center and continues to be an enormous sort of grounding of its material. But the other sort of bigger innovation I think that Pew Research brought to the story and brings every day to the story as they release, literally hundreds of data pieces and data stories every year, is to start with a mindset. The culture of Pew is to tell stories with data, and the best way we've thought to do that was with the mindset of a journalist. I was hired. I came out of journalism to be at the Pew Research Center. I was not a statistician, but I was a political reporter, and I knew what statistics meant to coverage of politics and policy. And the sense that you're thinking like a journalist and you're creating content for journalists. I can't tell you how many times we were in meetings thinking, what would a journalist care about in the story we were trying to tell our data? And I think, one of the sort of tragedies, but opportunities of this era is there are so many journalists who are not fully employed these days that those of you who want to be thinking like this or want to know how to get attention for your work through journalists might think about hiring one or at least having a contract relationship with a journalist because there is a mindset of journalism about how to do storytelling with inverted pyramids. You tell the biggest part of the story first, and then you build the evidence after you've told that headline kind of detail. And it's a special way of engaging things. And it's not a natural way for lots of people who work in administrative agencies or who work in the academy even to do storytelling. But if you just go back and look at some of the material you've learned about or have cared about from the Pew Research Center over the years, look at how it was written up and look at how the charts are organized. And it was the most important thing is that in the headline, and the most important thing is illustrated by the first graphic that illustrates the data. Graphics have to be readable and navigable, and there are ways in which you can butcher that if you don't think in the right way about the story you're going to tell. And graphics now, particularly in the social media age and beyond, and maybe to a similar degree in the AI age, people care about the methodology. And one of the sort of great treasures of the Pew Research Center is they feel like their work is a public good, and they do a lot of work for the survey and general data fields by explaining methodologies in a very understandable way, putting out lots of independent research on how people use data and how to think about data and the best collection methods for data and the best display methods for data. And one of the big contributions that Pew made over the years was to help the field of survey science moved from telephone surveys, which used to be the bedrock for decades up until the mid part of the 21st century aughts. And Pew was among the places documenting and spending a lot of money to show that phone polls were becoming less and less reliable because fewer and fewer people took them, and response rates were plummeting. And that the people who did take the time to answer the phone and answer our pollsters' questions were also quite more civic, more politically oriented, more policy oriented, just more generally plugged into their community life and the national life than other kinds of citizens who are busy doing other things and not necessarily data junkies and news junkies the way that more civic people were. So Pew, there are ways in which I'll show you that we brought the trust-inspiring documentation to our work, and we have spent a lot of time thinking, how is our stuff going to be misunderstood? And there were lots of ways in which we red teamed and stress test our data to make sure that we hoped that people would see the story we were anxious to tell to them, and that they would believe the story that we were telling them. We were not sort of playing keep away with the most important stuff, or we were actually pursuing an agenda that was, partisan or something like that. We by news, we were looking at several kinds of things that we wanted to do with our data, and that oriented the way we formed our questionnaires. It certainly oriented the way we wrote up our findings and displayed our findings in data graphics. So news is something new. So at one sense, it's something that's never been measured before or never been publicly disclosed before. So that, there's an easy way to take advantage of that. A lot of ways now, the basic elements of a news theme is something that's counter-conventional. You're pushing against conventional wisdom, the way people understand the world. So if you've got a story where data basically challenges the maps that people have in their head about how the world works, you're also capturing their attention by telling that story. Data are great for using news stories that discover change over time. A classic thing that we did at Pew was to measure all kinds of impacts of the internet use, broadband use, social media use, now AI use, and things like that. So literally, if you're mapping things over time, particularly if you see change over time, those are things to highlight as you're working with your data, headlining your data, designing graphics over your data. Subgroup comparisons are always interesting. Of course, the one that's now dominant in our culture is group differences by whether someone is Republican aligned or Democrat aligned. So if you've got some ways to think about your data in any kind of comparative terms, and it's by community types, it's by gender, it's by education levels, it's by location, particularly in a lot of your data. It's about measuring things that are going on in your community. Change over time is just an idiot proof way to tell a story, because it's people understand that that's an important thing that they ought to grasp in their communities. A refinement that Pew has done a lot, and lots of survey people and other folks in the academy do incredibly well, is create typologies of different kinds of citizens, depending on what they do and how they think and how they are engaging with the world and things. So one of the things to look for in your data is whether there are ways to combine it, and there are statistical tools that you can now use. Almost every statistical tool now allows you to do clustering that exposes sort of different kinds of actors in different ways, and different kinds of ways that people are using the tools that they're using, or using the media they're using, or acting as political actors in the way they are. So typologies are really, really, really good. And again, sort of great statisticians can help you figure out the ways to maybe make your data into typologies. And then particularly for administrative data, geographic and community type differences are a surefire story that's interesting to people. Particularly now with the easy to use map making tools that allow you to do quite vivid displays of what's going on between neighborhoods, between election districts, between neighborhoods in particular cities, like that. So there are ways to truly jazz up your data using those kind of tools. The link to trust measuring documentation, I'll show you how we did that at Pew, and we also sort of late in the game around 2011, 12, 13, we began to use computational social science tools to use data that are not survey data, but they were data being generated, for instance, by social media companies and other places like map making companies or things like that. So there are new tools out there for using those kind of analytical tests on your material. So here are ways that we or did some of those things at Pew. The single greatest day of traffic that I ever got when we were running the Internet and Technology Research Team was when we said on July 3rd, 2013, that 6% of online adults were Reddit users. So it's a small number, really. It's not the grandest number we ever produced. But the magic word in that headline is Reddit, because the Reddit community went basically berserk for this number. No one had ever documented how big they are. And so it just went wild, and we got sort of millions of hits in one day, which was unusual and actually never before achieved in our work. But it was also sort of a 6% number is one number. We didn't need to do anything fancy in a graphical sense to highlight that. So we put it in the headline of our report that day. But what we began to do is just work inside looking at subgroups. Where were some of the differences, or where were some of the interesting high level users of Reddit, who wasn't a big part of the population. But one of the easy ways to slice those data was by age and by gender. So we compared young men and women, middle-aged young men and people, men and women, and older men and women. And then sort of the headline of the graphic we did here, which was sort of right under the headline of the story, and was also sort of an easy sort of secondary headline for the whole piece that we did, was that the young men were by far the most, the heaviest users of Reddit. And as you can see on the bottom of this chart, first of all, the thing to learn that we applied at Pew over time was we began to headline our graphics with a story, not just with a label. We could have said, "Here's a portrait of Reddit users in the United States," and that kind of label might have drawn some attention. But it was easy enough to just take one of the data points through our analysis to highlight another thing going on in the data. So we hit that 15% number fairly hard. And just by saying, as in many cases with digital technologies, young men were early adopters and things, and this was part of that story. Um, and then you move on to another sort of simple thing that's a staple of the Pew Research Center, which is look at change over time. Those of you who have long-running data sets, you're sitting on crown jewels. You telling a story about change over time, or some cases even a change, the lack of change over time. And one of the, again, sort of with that reference point, thinking what's the conventional wisdom on this? And if the conventional wisdom is things have gone radically different in recent years than they were in years ago. If you tell a story sort of saying, that's not true. There's been a steady state of this phenomenon or this measurement for a long time, and you'd be wise to pay attention to it. And that's sort of an easy sell to in both the journalism market that you're potentially seeking coverage in, but also in social media. Attention grabbing and in search engine attention grabbing and things like that. So change over time or just measuring what's going on over time is its own virtue and its own story. Again, we used our headline in this case to tell a story rather than just provide a label. And one of the powerful memes that started when we started doing a lot of book related research, literally about what's happening with books in the era of ebooks. The suspicion at the dawn of when we were doing this in 2011 was that ebooks, like a lot of other digital products, were going to overtake the analog version of them. And soon enough, printed books would be an artifact of the past rather than something that sustained itself through the digital revolution. In fact, after a decade, we found still many more people were reading print books than were reading ebooks. But we also use these data to tell the story over time. And in the bottom row there, you can see that even as print books were holding up as a format for books, there was substantial change in the number of people who listened to book on ebooks. It went from 17% in 2011 to 30% in 2021. Again, and audiobooks, came of age during that same period. So we were telling multiple stories here. We thought that the point about print books having great survival skills was the main story here. Journalists thought so too. But they and we it's got up a lot of tensions because we headlined it that way, we promoted the story that way, and yet we had lots of other data that other people who were interested in segments of the industry could have picked up on. We also sort of began to sort of think a lot more consciously at the turn of the millennium about branding itself. And so you'll see that all Pew graphics now have brand elements like just literally the words on the bottom of the page there. That's a key thing. And then the color schema of the data, if you want to sort of be remembered over time, it's good to use the same format, the same typeface, the same colorings, the same markings for different things, and be consistent over time in the strategies of display that you're using. It actually was really interesting inside Pew because there were 10 different research units, and we all had to fight over the color chart about who got to get what parts of the spectrum. We felt like we prevailed with getting sort of nice blues and occasional olive colors in there that looked pretty sweet compared to some of the other options that we were given at the time. This is an example of a story that was really complicated, and we tried to simplify it without dumbing it down in the graphic that we created. We started doing some really serious artificial intelligence analysis and surveys at the dawn of the 2020s, actually a little bit before then. But we made some big editorial decisions in the display of these data that we then had to represent with the graphics that we created. Rather than asking lots and lots of questions about general AI in all of its different applications, but just asking just sort of, what do you think about AI? How do you relate to AI? Is it working for you? Do you use it? Is it helping or hurting or things like that? We broke this research into parts because we knew that people were using AI systems in different ways, and they were likely reacting in different ways to it. So we actually asked about 6 different topics in this survey. And we tried to, again, sort of tell a really interesting story here as we were looking both at artificial intelligence applications and human enhancement applications. The sort of big number that popped out of this data is at the bottom of the chart. We didn't even put it high up because it just had a natural place right there. But we used the headline and the underlying subhead to say that this is the thing we really think is fascinating about this story. And if you sort of want to understand one thing about this report we're doing, this is the one to understand that in this one case, a majority of the public doesn't think brain chip implants for cognitive abilities would be a terrifically good idea. And so there was more opposition for that than anything else. And yet we also wanted to make sure that people covering this and the interesting stakeholders in all of these areas of AI and human enhancement, they saw their place here because we didn't want to just make this a computer chip implant report. We had lots of data on lots of different technologies, and we began to highlight them with these labels: facial recognition, driverless cars, gene editing, and just to give the navigation through this graphic. We wanted to, first of all, make sure that it was tight and coherent, but we also wanted to make sure that different stakeholders saw their place here and maybe would be covering it from their perspective rather than the singular perspective that we were bringing in this graphic. The other thing that we did on each graphic was began to understand in the social media era, that right at the bottom there where it says AI and human enhancement, Americans' openness is tempered by a range of concerns. That was the title of this report that we did, and we now use the title of a report every time we run a graphic so that people could find it then. I think they've moved sometimes now to linking to the original report so people could find the context. But our understanding in the era of social media was that lots of this stuff was being shared on its own without the context of the full report we had behind it. And we wanted to make sure that people didn't have a hard time finding where the original source was and seeing some of the much bigger context and sort of nuance that we were bringing to those stories. One change, if you look at this graphic, what we still didn't do is the drawing the arrow that we drew in this other report that we did, where we looked at multiple dating apps, and we identified the people in the online user population who used data apps and we dating apps, and give this chart about what the demographics were of the various users of different dating apps. But if you sort of imagine that chart without that arrow and that little explainer box under it, it would be pretty hard to understand. So we began to use additional sort of signage to show people the story we were trying to tell. And so the headline says nearly half of online dating users report ever using Tinder and making it the most widely used app. So there's a way in which we're pointing to the headline, but we really wanted, by adding that arrow and that box, to help people sort of understand how to read that 79 number that sits next to the number ages 18 to 29. And again, we put lots of trust building material in the note there. So it's a pretty daunting thing if you're going to read through every part of it. But we know that some users are just very intent on learning those things, and we wanted to give them a roadmap to how to do that. And I just wanted to tell you one more battle story that I don't feel like I did a very good job on this one. It was exploration during the early, I guess it was just late 2020, early 2021, where we were looking at the public health strategies of contact tracing and quarantine recommendations, and we wanted to get public attitudes about how they felt about potentially working with public health officials on contact tracing encounters or quarantine recommendations. So that's a pretty big graphic because we asked about three ways in which interactions with public health officials could be done. We asked whether people had spoken with a health official, and we even broke that down into contacted by phone or speaking in their residence. We asked about three different possible ways to share information with those who are making contact tracing inquiries. Would they share the names of people they might have been in physical contact with, the places where they might have visited, the location data from their cell phone might give illustrations on that. And you can see under different circumstances, people were and weren't willing to share information for contact tracing. Then we finally asked if you were advised to quarantine, would you do it? And most Americans said they definitely or probably would. But we felt like we needed to sort of break the numbers down more refined in a more refined way, in part because we wanted to get to a final number about how many Americans would cooperate under the speaking with, sharing with, and quarantining on behalf of their fellow citizens. And so we did essentially a grid of the various ways people answered these questions, and about half of Americans said they would be comfortable in most of the three circumstances. By definition, that means half of Americans weren't necessarily willing to speak, share, and quarantine in all the ways that public health officials would have wanted them to. So this graphic sort of puts together all the possible variations of answers that people gave us in those previous questions and came out with 48% would basically do most of the things that public health officials would want. And yet a lot of people wouldn't, and a lot of people sort of bowed out of the survey because they felt we were asking pretty personal questions here, which is a very common thing when you're doing surveys about sensitive data like people's health data and things like that. So again, sort of a big, long note at the bottom of that to try to explain how to read this map. And the final thing we did was to sort of take that half of Americans who were going to cooperate basically across the board and see who that was comprised of demographically. And you can see there that there's pretty different, substantial differences by age, by education, by income status, and of course by partisan status at the bottom two lines there. So So we had a big story to tell, but it was such a complicated way to tell it that we didn't get nearly the amount of coverage that I expected we were going to get. And it was and yeah, it was a very nice public service, and we worked really hard to do it. But we were stumped on how to tell this story in a graphical way that was compelling and understandable, but also captured all the nuances of the data. The final story I'll tell you is about misinterpretation hassles, because Pew spent a lot of time thinking in the mid-teens about what to do about horse race polling in politics. You know, the who's up and who's down at every moment of the election cycle. And Pew made a very conscious decision to move away from horse race polling and to move towards what we call the tides of public opinion, not the waves. So lots more phenomena going on in elections than just sort of people's vote. You know, you're measuring changes in society. So Pew didn't want to get caught up in the maw of horse race polling. And so there were ways in which that we as an organization tried to move away from that. And part of the strategy was not to emphasize those numbers when we had them. And there were times in which we quite consciously sort of didn't put them in a prominent place in a report of ours because we wanted to tell different kinds of stories. In this particular survey, we were just interested at the dawn of the election cycle. Um, how much enthusiasm was there for the upcoming election in 2020? And it turns out we captured what really happened, which was there's stupendous amount of interest in the election. And an obvious thing to do is to ask which candidates are sort of striking you in an interesting way. So we had some numbers, not nearly close to the headline of the report and not emphasized in any particular way. We had a Biden number and a Sanders number and a Warren number and a Buttigieg number and stuff like that. The next day's coverage, or even that afternoon's coverage of that report, the horse race numbers were the most prominent thing mentioned in all of those news organizations. And so there are ways in which and I'm sure it's befallen you that the best efforts you have to tell a story that you think is the most important one and most consequential one is not necessarily the ones that the world is going to pick up on, either in the social media universe or in the news universe. And so just I feel your pain because we've felt your pain in similar ways. The final two things I just wanted to mention just quickly, just to show you I'm interested, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, is that in addition now to for Pew thinking about how to sell its material or to get attention for its material in the press, you really have to think now in many ways like a search engine or like a social media influencer, and nowadays like a large language model creator, because those are the mediators of a lot of statistical material for the public. And there are ways we can talk about that, but it's a challenging universe where the old school, the sort of 20th century ways of thinking about headlines, thinking about very compelling data points that you want to sell are not necessarily the way that the world works. So I close with Walter Lippmann again, sort of reminding you of the grand purpose of your work. There could be no liberty for a community which lacks the means by which to detect lies. That in many respects, those of you who are communicators and data stewards and data provisioners, you are at a precious place in our culture now to sort of play with the Washington Post tagline, democracy dies when epistemology fails. Liberty collapses when lies and propaganda supplant accurate data and truth detection mechanisms, and that's the business you're in, is promoting that kind of stuff. Here's how you can reach me, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah,
Yeah.
for the tour de force, bringing us back centuries right up to the present day. And it looks like we have some questions for the audience, and maybe I'll just take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first one, which is how do you believe these generative AI technologies and tools may, change these workflows, change the way that people understand and access these kinds of, really sharp data graphics? What's your sort of take? And with the proviso that this is all emerging, like we don't quite know yet, but what are your thoughts?
Well, there are a couple of sort of obvious intervention points where AI enters the process. I mean, for survey researchers, maybe just thinking about the questions themselves. And one of the sort of better functions of AI tools is to write well and write clearly and to turn complicated thoughts and ideas into sort of more understandable kinds of questions. And also, I've actually found some helpful tips from AI systems just in being neutral in your question language. I mean, everybody who does surveys, who's worth a nickel, really wants to ask questions that can't, where the question language itself doesn't sort of steer anybody who's answering the question to an answer that they want to give you or that you, the question asker, want them to give to you. So finding good neutral language with AIs has been pretty good. On the analytical side, our AI systems aren't a bad way to start your data inquiry. Feeding your data into a language model and saying, what do you see here? They're getting much better at that. They were just, distressingly bad in the earliest days of ChatGPT. By the way, ChatGPT is 3 years old. November 30th, 2022 is when we met this world as a large scale public. And to think about that, first of all, the adoption of language models themselves. I mean, right now, nearing on 2/3 of American adults use them in a variety of ways, both at work and for personal enrichment and other kinds of activities. So we've never seen the growth of a digital tool or any tool really at this level. And so now I go turn back to saying they're getting better at it. If you pump data into them and sort of seeing what to look for, but God knows you've got to double, triple, quadruple check what you're seeing. And on the graphics side, I've just begun to play with different kinds of displays, and it's pretty thoughtful and innovative. There are ways that sort of say, turn this into a bar chart or a line chart or something like that. But do this with the sort of bubble representations of the size and intensity of these feelings or this episode or of this data point. And they're pretty clever at doing that. What they aren't particularly good yet at is the combination of text and display that you really want, particularly as a survey researcher, to help people navigate through the systems. They're getting better a little bit at that. And one final point, which is a workflow point, John, more than anything else, is reconciling text, the narrative that you're telling alongside the graphic you're building, is it's hard to do when you're a survey researcher. The instinct is to write in the text the exact same thing you've said in the graphic that sits right next to the dang text. And so you don't want to be boring and stuff. And there are ways in which the interplay of those things, if you start fiddling with them on AI systems, it's not too terribly bad. The other sort of fun thing that I do quite commonly now is when I get a data set, and oftentimes I'm only sent a PDF originally by vendors, is to throw it into Google Notebook and and ask for the podcast feature so that it analyzes your data and then it gives you a podcast of the data that just come out. And if you say, write it up like a very chatty but newsy oriented podcast, or just think about a news organization putting out this in audio form. It is amazing how discerning they are and how they pick up stuff that's literally unstructured data sitting in a PDF. There's no structure to it at all, and it's a quite sharp system. And I know a lot of academics who actually, sort of get Google Notebook to be their drive time audio now as they're commuting back and forth to work, because it's terrific at sort of leveling off, or I would say dumbing down highly technical research papers into something that's understandable.
Thank you. We have a number of questions in our Q&A, and I'll just read them out to you, Lee. And by the way, we had over 230 participants, and so like we're very pleased to have such a great turnout for Lee. But let's try to put some tough questions to him. Javier says, "What is the role of government communicators when politics gets in the way of capturing or reporting data?" Similar to what's been happening with unemployment numbers, economic and GDP data.
Well, I think that, the starting point for a lot of that is the very well documented in polls decline in trust in government data itself. Um, And so part of it is all of the sort of standard trust building and sort of trust reinforcing mechanisms that you already have. I mean, describing how you got what you've got, describing maybe some of the limits of what you've got, certainly correcting mistakes if they're found, but and defending what you do and describing it and why it's the way that it's been done, and if methodologies have changed or things have been compromised. Fessing up to that kind of stuff. I can't tell you how many exchanges I've been in public where the just a normal kind of dialogue. Sometimes you get, into arguments with folks who hate your guts and don't believe your data, and you're not going to win that argument. But engaging with those folks, at least at some level, um, is a benefit to your organization for the lurkers who are there. Many of them understand that it's not an argument that either side is going to convince the other. But if you're um, thoughtful, intelligent, um, bring some game about just the history of why things are done the way they were done, and certainly civil. People will turn to you, and you'll never be able to capture it fully about how effective you've been, but just your sort of presentation and your presence in an encounter is being watched. And it's just awful to think that any misstep you make, inadvertent probably, is still going to get exploited, and you're still going to get hammered for things that you do and say, and the trolls are going to go after you under any circumstances. But I think standing your ground, being proud of what you do, maybe every once in a while just invoking the history of how things get done and how literally in many of your cases the data collection process has improved over time. The methods of analysis have way improved over time. The level of nuance and explanatory power you can bring to the data have improved over time. And it just literally storytelling with the story of data is a way to win friends.
As well said. David asks, what are some of the most popular and effective data analytics apps and services?
Well, Pew and actually my work at Elon too. It's sort of a two-step process. So the analytics, this a standard one. Well, Python's great now, and R is great now, and SPSS is a common statistical tool that's used by government agencies and academics. SAS is a popular tool used by them. The insufficiency of a lot of that. Well, R is wonderful for data display and stuff like that. The rest of them are sort of have their limits, and in many respects, one of the pleasures of working with data is working with a graphics designer to sort of say, here's how it works. The other, if you don't have high class professional graphics designers, next to hiring a journalist to help you figure out the storytelling power, you've got it at your command. Thinking of a really classy graphics designer is just enormously helpful. It's a difference between something that is compelling and a good argument and a good sort of state of description of what's going on in the world, and something that looks dense and indecipherable or just sort of hard to read. So that's another way to do it. But it's a two-step process in the world I live in, where we lavish attention on literally the pictorial side of the graphic as well as the data that are inside it, because that's how people, you want people on first glance to know what you're telling them. And it's a combination of both the text and the number display itself.
Deborah asks, I use a lot of, or first states, I use a lot of Pew Research data, but often find the headlines tend to pick a side, optimist versus pessimist, or glass half full versus glass half empty. The COVID data is a good example. How do you decide which way to go with many poll results that are like where it's like 50-50? Like how do you put a gloss or an interpretation in the headline or
It's
in the
it's yeah, it's the agonizing part of doing your data. I mean, again, thinking of what will sort of reasonably interested news consumers um, make of this? And they kind of, they kind of want some help in the first level of navigation, and then they want a bunch of clues about how that first level of navigation ought to trigger deeper analysis, deeper thought, and things like that. So, um, and it's a constant, you know, struggle. And usually, we had the luxury at Pew, and I hope in the way that you design your displays and stuff like that, a headline and a subheadline often cover the sort of multiple sides of a story. So the underline or the descriptive line of what the headline is sort of says, yes, yes, it's so, but there are lots of ways in which there are worries about these things, or there are interesting partisan differences that by implication you ought to pay attention to, or gender differences or stuff like that. So one of the easier mechanisms to cope with multiple sides of a story is to make sure that double-barreled explanation that you're giving in the very first words you're giving them recognizes that, and give people some sense that you're not just got your finger on the scale.
Lee, we have about 7 minutes left, and I see four questions here. So maybe we'll just take them kind of rather quickly so we can make sure we
Yeah.
get them all in. One is about accessibility. So how has or does accessibility affect your communications?
It's important and interesting, and there are lots of accessibility tools now that you can essentially plug and play. So you make sure your lines are readable, that the explanations that go with the data are just lifted right out of the data. And AI is quite good. I mean, these systems have gotten a lot better over time. Um, and there were times in which, for the sake of making things accessible, there are ways in which, as you might know, when you scroll over the data, sometimes the accessibility information overlays the data that are there. So it sometimes makes some data displays harder for some people to read who are reading them, but there, of course, the folks who are hearing impaired or I'm sorry, seeing impaired are getting all the benefit of that. So it's best practices. I mean, the profession wants it. There are requirements of law that are essentially you have to live by, and so it's not really an option not to do that now, unless you're really running a dinky kind of website kind of thing.
Um, Speaking of AI, in the age of AI, where this is from an anonymous participant, and by the way, the last question was from Ashley, so thank you, Ashley, for asking that. This participant asks where images can be generated and data can be made up because of AI technologies. What can we do as storytellers to safeguard and tell the truth? Is this something that's even in our hands? Essentially, how do we tell the truth in an age where the public and can be misled? Um, and not believe our eyes and ears.
I might even ask for your thoughts on this, John, or and even folks in the audience. Um, we're going to need increasingly sophisticated verification or validations for us. There are not really good systems that I'm aware of now where you can do sort of chain of evidence and chain of command where you can sort of say, this is us. And there's a way to verify this and a scheme for you to be sure that this is our material. The great Vint Cerf, who is a longtime advisor and participant in our work, has made the prediction that we're heading into an age where proof of what you've done is going to be a requirement for anybody who's in knowledge work or basically anything like that. And it's the presumption is going to flip now that things come from AI or things are tricked with, unless you've really shown some level of proof in a system that people trust that you've done the work that you've done. It's horrible that we are in this environment. People are struggling amazingly um, to navigate to the truth and things like that. And it took a couple of hundred years for the scientific revolution to establish the basic principles and precepts and markers of truth telling. And we can't afford that amount of time to figure this stuff out. So I'm inviting this community really to be thinking more about flipping the presumption is we're going to prove to you who we are, and it's up to you, and we're going to have a verification scheme that you can rely on. You're muted.
Sorry. 3 minutes left and three questions. So let's see if we can take them in short order. Stephen asks, should the story always emerge from the data, or are there times when a story is the basis for the data collection?
Well, in survey work, you're kind of picking the domain in which you're doing the work, and over time you develop sort of sixth senses about where the edge of the story might be, and but it's an art more than a science. There were many times when I felt we at the Internet Project were asking about things too late. We weren't picking up the earliest adopters of things. There were times when we overplayed things just because we thought the world would be trending in one way. We did some big questions about the metaverse. We did some big questions about Second Life, the kissing cousin to that, and it just never sort of turned into a thing. And so anyway, that's the survey world. The beautiful thing about the sort of luxury of all the data that we have is that you can start querying the data once you get it. I mean, it's in the scientific community, it's called the fourth paradigm. You just throw your data out there and you see what emerges there rather than structuring your data at the beginning to sort of say, well, look at this, we're going to ask this way, we're going to, structure the data the following way. It's a beautiful set of opportunities now. And the computational social science field is improving all the time. It was a rough start, as in all rough starts. And now it's just there are ways in which a data set plopping onto someone's desk and thinking through, there's some logical fields in this data that are going to be more interesting than others. But after that, it's like letting the computational universe we live in go to town. Oftentimes that works pretty well.
Final question here. I'm going to combine two, one from an anonymous participant, another from Ariana. Um, Given that we are actually, this lines up exactly with what you were talking about. So, given that we're often using automated large scale data analytics applications, but then we're trying to combine that with personal human centric narratives. Do you have any tips for, data teams or communications teams that are trying to make sure that the human and the machine are combined in a fruitful way, uh, so that the human's in the loop and that it is also an effective communication?
Yeah, I mean, the happiest marriage is between quantitative and qualitative because the story, once you release data, inevitably is why. Why is this thing changed? Why are these differences so meaningful and stuff like that? And if you only rely, unless you ask a sort of ungodly number of follow-up questions, you're never going to sort of pin that down, or you'll find what the real truth is, which is there are many reasons for this. So thinking on both scales at the same time. So if you're just dealing with administrative data, you've got a story you want to tell. I prepare a SWAT team of going out into the community and finding exemplars of the types that you want to describe. And having structured interviews or sometimes unstructured interviews, act like a journalist and sort of say, what's going on with you on this? And illustrating, leavening the quantitative stuff with a lot of insight from qualitative, and literally quotes and explanations and analysis based on that.
Well, Lee, you have leavened our knowledge base and understanding of data greatly, and just want to thank you. A round of applause from the many hundreds who attended this. It's been terrific. The Amplify series will continue on. The schedule is on the website, and thanks again for turning out. And Lee, anything else? Any final words of?
Just it's fun to do this, as you might tell from the way I did it, and you're doing the Lord's work out there. You're doing important things for our democracy, and keep at it.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks
Thank you
again,
so,
Lee.
thank you so much. I'm closing the session now. Thank you.